The wagon wheels groaned against the frozen earth as Nora Preston pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The bitter December wind of 1881 cutting through the thin fabric like a knife through butter. Fort Garland, Colorado materialized before her like a mirage through the swirling snow. A collection of wooden buildings huddled together against the relentless cold of the San Luis Valley. Ice crystals clung to her eyelashes, and tears streamed down her cheeks, though whether from the wind or the weight of the past 3 days, she could no longer tell. Her father lay wrapped in blankets behind her in the wagon bed, his body still and cold, taken by pneumonia just 2 days after they had left Kansas City. She had no money for a proper burial, no family waiting in this God-forsaken town, and no idea how she would survive the winter that had already sunk its teeth deep into the mountains surrounding this isolated settlement. Xavier Lawson stepped out of the livery stable just as the wagon lurched to a halt in the middle of the main street. At 26, he had seen his share of desperate travelers passing through Fort Garland, but something about the way this young woman sat hunched on the wagon seat, her face streaked with frozen tears, made him pause. Her hands gripped the reins with a white-knuckled desperation, and when she finally looked up, her green eyes held a hollow emptiness that reminded him of soldiers he had known during the war. He crossed the distance between them in long strides, his boots crunching in the snow, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "Miss, are you injured?" His voice carried the gentle drawl of someone raised in Tennessee before the war had scattered families like leaves in a storm. Nora tried to speak, but her throat had closed around the words. She shook her head, then gestured weakly toward the back of the wagon. Xavier moved around to look, his expression shifting from concern to understanding as he saw the still form wrapped in blankets. He had lost his own father to illness years ago, and he recognized the particular grief that came with traveling alone with the dead. "I will help you," he said simply, and something in those 4 words broke through the numbness that had carried her through the last 48 hours. Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks, and this time she did not try to stop them. Within an hour, Xavier had arranged for her father's body to be taken to the undertaker, a somber man named Morrison who promised a decent burial despite Nora's lack of funds. Xavier had paid for it himself, waving away her stammered protests with a quiet insistence that they could discuss repayment later. He led her exhausted horse to the livery, ensuring the animal would be fed and watered, then guided Nora through the snow-covered streets to a small cabin at the edge of town. The warmth hit her like a physical force when he opened the door. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, filling the single room with blessed heat that made her realize just how deeply the cold had penetrated her bones. The cabin was simple but clean, with a bed in one corner, a table with 2 chairs near the fire, shelves lined with books and supplies, and a small kitchen area where a coffee pot sat perpetually warming on the stove. "Sit by the fire," Xavier said, pulling one of the chairs closer to the hearth. "I will make you something hot to drink." Nora sank into the chair, her legs trembling with exhaustion and relief. She watched as he moved about the small space with practiced efficiency, preparing coffee and setting a pot of stew to warm. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and brown eyes that held a kindness she had not expected to find in this harsh landscape. His hands were calloused from hard work, but his movements were gentle as he handed her a cup of coffee. "Thank you," she whispered, wrapping her frozen fingers around the warm tin cup. "I do not know how I can ever repay you. You can start by telling me your name," he said, settling into the other chair with his own cup. "Nora Preston. I came from Kansas City with my father." We were supposed to meet his brother here, but I think the address we had must have been wrong, or maybe he moved on. We could not find him, and then my father took sick." The words tumbled out now, 3 days of silence breaking like a dam. "I do not even know if his brother is still alive." We had not heard from him in 5 years. Xavier listened without interrupting, letting her tell the story at her own pace. She was younger than he had first thought, perhaps 22 or 23, with honey blonde hair that had come loose from its pins to frame a face made gaunt by grief and the hardships of travel. There was a strength in her, though, visible in the set of her jaw and the way she held herself upright despite her obvious exhaustion. "What was your uncle's name?" he asked when she had finished. "Robert Preston. He worked as a surveyor for the railroad, or at least he did 5 years ago." Xavier shook his head slowly. "I have been in Fort Garland for 3 years now, and I have not heard that name. But the railroad brings men through constantly. He might have moved on to one of the construction camps further west." Nora nodded, though the last fragile hope in her eyes dimmed. She had known it was unlikely, but hearing it confirmed made her situation feel even more desperate. She had $37 sewn into the lining of her coat, the last of her family's savings. It would not last long, even in a small town like this. "You can stay here tonight," Xavier said, as if reading her thoughts. "I will sleep at the livery. Tomorrow, after the burial, we can figure out what comes next." "I cannot take your bed," Nora protested, but Xavier was already gathering a blanket and his coat. "You can and you will. You have been through enough these past days. Get some rest, Miss Preston." He paused at the door, looking back at her. "I am sorry about your father." The door closed behind him before she could respond, leaving her alone in the warm cabin with the crackling fire and the overwhelming realization that a complete stranger had shown her more kindness in a single afternoon than she had encountered in months of traveling. She finished her coffee, ate a bowl of the stew he had prepared, and then collapsed onto the bed without even removing her boots. Sleep claimed her instantly, deep and dreamless. The burial took place the next morning under a sky so blue and clear it seemed almost cruel in its beauty. The storm had passed during the night, leaving Fort Garland blanketed in fresh snow that sparkled in the early sunlight. Nora stood beside the grave with Xavier at her side, Morrison and a young priest completing their small group. The priest spoke words of comfort that washed over her without penetrating the numb shell she had rebuilt around herself overnight. Xavier stood close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, a solid presence in a world that had become untethered. When it was over, Xavier walked her back through town, moving slowly to match her faltering steps. The main street of Fort Garland was coming to life, merchants opening their shops, women hurrying toward the general store with baskets over their arms, men gathering outside the saloon despite the early hour. Several people nodded to Xavier as they passed, their eyes curious as they took in Nora walking beside him. "Everyone is looking at me," Nora murmured. "Fort Garland is a small town. New faces draw attention, especially ones as pretty as yours." Xavier said it matter-of-factly, without any hint of impropriety, but Nora felt heat rise to her cheeks nonetheless. They returned to the cabin, and Xavier built up the fire while Nora sat at the table, her hands folded in her lap. The question she had been avoiding all morning finally forced its way past her lips. "What am I going to do now?" Xavier poured them both coffee and sat down across from her. "That depends on what you want to do. Do you have family back in Kansas City?" Nora shook her head. "My mother died when I was 15. It has been just my father and me since then. We left Kansas City because he lost his job at the mill. He thought starting fresh out here with his brother would give us a new beginning." She laughed, a bitter sound. I suppose we should have written ahead first. Fort Garland is not a large town, but there are opportunities for someone willing to work. Mrs. Hartley, who runs the boarding house, has been looking for help since her daughter got married and moved to Denver. The school teacher, Miss Brooks, mentioned she could use an assistant now that the town is growing and more families are settling here. The general store owners, the Mitchells, are getting older and might appreciate someone to help with the heavier work. Nora listened, a small spark of hope kindling in her chest. You think they would hire me, a stranger with no references? You would not be a stranger if I vouched for you, Xavier said simply. And I will if you want me to. Why are you helping me? The question burst out before she could stop it. You do not know me. You have no reason to trust me or to spend your money on my father's burial or to offer your home. Why? Xavier was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee. When he finally looked up, his brown eyes held a depth of emotion that made Nora's breath catch. 5 years ago, I came to Fort Garland with nothing but a horse and a saddle. I had been drifting since the war ended, taking work where I could find it, never staying anywhere long. I was tired and angry and lost. A man named Thomas Bridger owned the livery then. He gave me a job, a place to sleep, and a reason to stop running. He taught me everything about horses and blacksmithing and what it meant to build a life instead of just surviving. When he died 2 years ago, he left the livery to me. He said I had earned it, but the truth is, he saved my life just by showing me kindness when I needed it most. He met her eyes directly. I see that same look in your eyes that I used to see in the mirror, Miss Preston. You have lost everything, and you are trying to figure out if you have the strength to start over. I am helping you because someone helped me once, and because I believe Fort Garland could be a new beginning for you, if you want it to be. Nora felt tears prick her eyes again, but this time they were not born entirely of grief. I want it to be, she whispered. I do not want to keep running. I am so tired of being afraid. Then stay. We will make it work. Over the following days, Xavier introduced Nora to the key members of Fort Garland's small community. Mrs. Hartley, a stout woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, looked Nora up and down before nodding approvingly. You are thin, but you look strong enough. Can you cook, clean, change linens without complaining? Yes, madam, to all three, Nora replied, keeping her voice steady despite her nervousness. Good. You can start tomorrow. I will provide room and board plus $2 a week. The room is small, but it is clean and warm. You will take your meals with me and help with the cooking and cleaning for my boarders. Most are railroad men or miners passing through, but I run a respectable establishment. No drinking, no men in your room, and church on Sundays. It was not much, but it was more than Nora had dared hope for. She accepted immediately, and Mrs. Hartley's stern expression softened slightly. Xavier Lawson is a good judge of character. If he vouches for you, that is enough for me. Welcome to Fort Garland, Miss Preston. That evening, Nora and Xavier shared dinner at his cabin one last time before she moved to the boarding house. She had insisted on cooking, wanting to repay his kindness in some small way, and had managed to create a surprisingly good meal from the simple ingredients in his pantry. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, the fire crackling gently in the background. I cannot thank you enough for everything you have done, Nora said as they finished eating. You gave me hope when I had none left. Xavier smiled, the expression transforming his usually serious face. You did that yourself. I just pointed you in the right direction. Will I see you again? Nora asked, suddenly aware that she did not want to lose this connection, this friendship that had formed so quickly in the crucible of crisis. Fort Garland is not a large town, Miss Preston. We will see each other every day if you want to. The boarding house is only 3 buildings down from the livery. You could stop by any time." He hesitated, then added, "I would like that. Stopping by, I mean, if you would." "I would," Nora said, feeling warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. "I would like that very much." The winter months passed with a rhythm that was both grueling and comforting. Nora worked from dawn until late evening at the boarding house, cooking meals, washing linens, scrubbing floors, and managing the constant stream of men who rented rooms by the night or week. Mrs. Hartley was a demanding employer, but fair, and Nora found satisfaction in the hard work. It kept her hands busy and her mind from dwelling too long on her grief. True to his word, Xavier stopped by the boarding house frequently. Sometimes it was just to say hello. Other times he would help Nora carry heavy buckets of water or split wood for the stoves. On Sundays, after church services in the small chapel that doubled as the schoolhouse during the week, they would walk together through the town, talking about everything and nothing. Nora learned that Xavier had grown up on a farm in Tennessee, that he had lied about his age to join the Confederate Army at 16, that he had spent years after the war trying to outrun the memories of what he had seen and done. "I was so angry," he told her one Sunday afternoon as they walked along the creek that ran behind the town, its surface frozen solid. "Angry at the war, at the men who started it, at God for letting it happen. I did things during those years after that I am not proud of. I drank too much, fought too much, wandered from town to town picking fights and generally making a mess of my life." "What changed?" Nora asked, watching her breath form clouds in the cold air. "Thomas Bridger. He told me that I could keep running from my past, or I could stand still long enough to build a future. He said the war had taken enough from me, and it was time I stopped letting it take more, so I stayed. I worked. I learned to find peace in simple things like the smell of a forge, the satisfaction of shoeing a horse properly, the quiet of a winter morning." He looked at her, his expression serious. "I found a reason to stop being angry." Nora understood. She had her own anger, her own grief to contend with. But here, in this small town surrounded by mountains, with work that exhausted her body and conversations with Xavier that engaged her mind, she was beginning to find her own version of peace. In turn, Nora told Xavier about her childhood in Kansas City, about her mother who had been a seamstress and taught Nora to appreciate beautiful things even when they had very little. She told him about her father, who had worked hard his entire life but never quite managed to get ahead, who had dreamed of owning his own business someday. She told him about the books she loved to read, the poems she had memorized as a girl, the secret ambition she had once harbored to become a teacher herself. "You could still do that," Xavier said. "Miss Brooks is 60 if she is a day. She has been talking about retiring and moving to live with her sister in Santa Fe. The town will need a new teacher." "I did not finish my own schooling," Nora admitted. "I only completed 8 grades before my mother got sick and I had to stay home to care for her." "You are smarter than half the people in this town with fancy degrees," Xavier said with conviction. "I have seen the books you borrow from the general store. I have heard you talk about literature and history. You would make a wonderful teacher." The thought took root in Nora's mind and refused to leave. She began studying in earnest during her few free hours, reading every book she could get her hands on, making notes on teaching methods, even helping Miss Brooks grade papers on occasion. The elderly teacher was delighted to have assistants and began mentoring Nora, teaching her the practical skills that no book could provide. As winter slowly gave way to early spring, the friendship between Nora and Xavier deepened into something more. It happened gradually, in small moments that accumulated like snowflakes until they formed something solid and undeniable. The way Xavier's eyes would search for her at church services. The way Nora's heart would lift when she saw him walking down the street. The accidental brush of hands when they walked together. The conversations that stretched long into the evening, both reluctant to say goodnight. It was Mrs. Hartley who finally voiced what the entire town had been gossiping about for weeks. "That Lawson boy is courting you," she said one morning as she and Nora prepared breakfast for the boarders. "He is too polite to make his intentions clear without encouragement, so if you care for him, you had better let him know." Nora felt her cheeks flame. "I do not know what you mean, Mrs." Hartley snorted. "Child, I have run this boarding house for 23 years. I know what courting looks like. The question is, do you care for him?" Nora was quiet, focusing intently on the eggs she was scrambling. Did she care for Xavier? The answer was so obvious it made her chest ache. She cared for him more than she had ever cared for anyone. She thought about him constantly. She treasured their conversations, looked forward to their Sunday walks with an anticipation that made the rest of the week bearable. When he smiled at her, she felt like the sun had come out from behind clouds. When he was nearby, she felt safe in a way she had not felt since her mother died. "Yes," she finally whispered. "I care for him very much." "Then tell him so. Life is too short for dancing around what matters, Mrs." Hartley's voice was gruff, but her eyes were kind. "You have both suffered enough. Take some happiness where you can find it." That Sunday, when Xavier asked if she wanted to walk after church, Nora suggested they go beyond their usual route, following the creek further up into the foothills. The snow had melted except in the shadowed places, and the first wildflowers were beginning to appear, small splashes of purple and yellow against the brown earth. They walked in companionable silence for a while, following a narrow trail that wound between pine trees and granite outcroppings. Xavier finally broke the silence. "Nora, I need to tell you something and I am not sure how to say it properly." Her heart began to race. "Just say it plainly. That is what I like best about you. You do not hide behind fancy words." He stopped walking and turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. His palms were warm and calloused, strong and gentle all at once. "I have been trying to find the right time to speak about this for weeks now, but there never seems to be a perfect moment, so I will just say it. I care for you, Nora, more than I thought I could care for anyone. You are the first thing I think about when I wake up and the last thing on my mind before I sleep. I want to court you properly if you will have me. I want a future with you." Nora felt tears spring to her eyes, but they were good tears this time, happy tears. "I care for you too, Xavier. I have been so afraid to hope for this, to believe that something good could come from the worst days of my life. But you make me happy. You make me believe in new beginnings." Xavier pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her, and Nora rested her head against his chest, hearing the steady beat of his heart through his shirt. They stood like that for a long moment, holding each other in the spring sunshine, letting the world narrow down to just the two of them. "I do not have much to offer," Xavier said quietly, his chin resting on top of her head. "The livery does well enough and I have saved some money. I built the cabin myself and it is small but solid. I could add a room or two if we needed. I would work hard to provide for you to make you happy." Nora pulled back enough to look up at him, reaching up to touch his face. "You already make me happy. I do not need much, Xavier. I just need you." He leaned down and kissed her then, gentle and sweet, a kiss full of promise and hope. Nora felt the last pieces of her broken heart begin to knit back together, the wound of her father's death and all the losses that had preceded it finally beginning to heal. She had come to Fort Garland with nothing but grief and desperation. She had found a home, work, and now love. It felt like more than she deserved, Like grace she had not earned but would treasure nonetheless. Their courtship became official, which in a town the size of Fort Garland meant everyone knew about it within approximately 3 hours. The other women at church smiled knowingly at Nora, and several of the men clapped Xavier on the back with congratulations. Mrs. Hartley maintained her stern exterior, but began baking Nora's favorite pie more frequently, which Nora recognized as approval in its own right. They spent their Sundays together, but also began sharing weekday evenings. Nora would finish her work at the boarding house and walk to the livery, where Xavier would be closing up for the night. They would stroll together through the town, sometimes stopping at the general store for supplies, other times simply walking and talking until the sun set behind the mountains. Xavier introduced her to his work, teaching her about the different breeds of horses that came through the livery, showing her the intricacies of blacksmithing and how to tell if a horse was favoring one leg over another. Nora shared her dreams of teaching with him, and Xavier listened with genuine interest, asking questions and encouraging her ambitions. In May, Miss Brooks announced her retirement, and the town council began searching for a new teacher. Xavier encouraged Nora to apply, and though she was terrified of rejection, she submitted her name for consideration. The interview took place in the church, with 3 council members asking her questions about education, discipline, and her qualifications. Nora answered as honestly as she could, acknowledging the gaps in her formal education, but emphasizing her love of learning and her commitment to the children of Fort Garland. A week later, she received word that the position was hers. The salary was modest, $30 a month plus the use of the small teacherage cottage behind the schoolhouse, but it was more money than she had ever made, and it meant she could finally move out of the boarding house and have a home of her own. Xavier was thrilled, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around when she told him the news, both of them laughing with pure joy. The school year would not begin until September, which gave Nora the summer to prepare. She moved into the teacherage in June, spending her days cleaning and organizing the schoolhouse, reviewing textbooks and planning lessons. Xavier helped her in the evenings, painting the walls of the cottage, fixing a leaky window, building shelves for her growing collection of books. They worked side by side, talking and laughing, and Nora thought she had never been happier. One evening in late July, as they sat on the porch of the teacherage watching the sun paint the mountains gold and purple, Xavier took her hand. "Nora, I want to ask you something, and I want you to think about it seriously before you answer." She turned to look at him, noting the nervous energy in his posture. "What is it?" "I love you. I have loved you since that first day when you rode into town with tears on your face and grief in your eyes. I have loved watching you heal and grow stronger. I love your intelligence, your kindness, your determination. I love the way you laugh and the way you think about things deeply. I love who I am when I am with you." He took a deep breath. "I want to marry you, Nora Preston. I want to wake up beside you every morning and fall asleep holding you every night. I want to build a life with you, raise a family with you, grow old with you. Will you marry me?" Nora felt her vision blur with tears. She had known this was coming, had hoped for it, but hearing the words still made her heart feel too big for her chest. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking. "Yes, Xavier, I will marry you. I love you so much." He pulled a small box from his pocket and opened it to reveal a simple gold band with a small diamond. "It belonged to my grandmother. It is the only thing I have left from my family. I want you to have it." Nora let him slip the ring onto her finger, marveling at how perfectly it fit, how right it felt. They held each other as the stars began to appear overhead, making plans and promises in whispered voices. They were married in September, just before the school year began. The ceremony took place in the small church, with what felt like the entire town in attendance. Mrs. Hartley cried, though she would later insist it was merely dust in her eyes. The Mitchells from the general store had closed their shop for the afternoon to attend. Even some of the rough miners and railroad workers who had stayed at the boarding house cleaned up and came to witness the union. Nora wore a dress that Mrs. Hartley and several other women had helped her sew. Simple but beautiful in white muslin with lace at the collar and cuffs. Xavier wore his best suit, his hair neatly combed, his eyes bright with happiness as he watched Nora walk down the aisle toward him. They spoke their vows in steady voices, promising to love and cherish each other through whatever life might bring. The reception was held in the boarding house dining room, with food contributed by nearly every family in town. There was music and dancing, laughter and toasts, and through it all, Xavier and Nora could barely take their eyes off each other. When it was finally time to leave, they walked hand in hand to the cabin that was now their home. Xavier had indeed added 2 rooms over the summer, creating a proper bedroom and a small study where Nora could prepare her lessons. Their wedding night was tender and sweet, a gentle exploration of love and intimacy that left them both breathless and amazed. Nora had been nervous, her limited knowledge coming from whispered conversations with married women and her own imagination. But Xavier was patient and careful, making sure she felt safe and cherished. They fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, and Nora thought she had never felt more content. Married life suited them both. Nora threw herself into teaching with passion and dedication. Her students ranged from 6-year-olds learning their letters to 14-year-olds studying advanced mathematics. She loved the challenge of reaching each child where they were, of seeing their faces light up with understanding. She was firm but fair, and the children responded to her with respect and affection. Xavier continued to run the livery, his business growing as Fort Garland expanded. The railroad was pushing further west, bringing more people through town, and Xavier's reputation as an honest businessman and skilled blacksmith brought him steady work. He took on an apprentice, a 16-year-old boy named Thomas, whom he taught with the same patience that Thomas Bridger had once shown him. In the evenings, they would share dinner and talk about their days. Xavier would tell her about the horses he had shod, the travelers passing through with stories of the world beyond Fort Garland. Nora would share funny things her students had said, challenges she was facing with certain lessons, small triumphs when a struggling child finally grasped a difficult concept. On Sundays, they attended church and then spent the afternoons walking or reading together. Simple pleasures that felt precious after the years both had spent alone. The first winter of their marriage was harsh, with snow piling up past the windows and temperatures dropping so low that water froze solid in its bucket overnight. But inside their cabin, warmth and love created a refuge against the cold. They would sit by the fire in the evenings, Nora grading papers while Xavier read or worked on small repair projects. Sometimes they would read aloud to each other, sharing favorite passages from books. Sometimes they simply sat in comfortable silence, the presence of the other enough. In February, Nora began to suspect she might be pregnant. She waited until she was certain before telling Xavier, wanting to be sure before raising his hopes. When she finally told him one evening over dinner, his face went through a series of expressions so quickly she almost laughed. Shock, then joy, then worry, then back to joy again. "Are you certain?" he asked, coming around the table to kneel beside her chair. "As certain as I can be. I have missed my monthly time twice now, and I have been feeling sick in the mornings. Mrs. Hartley says those are sure signs." "You told Mrs. Hartley before you told me," Xavier asked, but he was grinning. She guessed. "Apparently I turned green while cooking breakfast last week." Nora took his hands. "Are you happy?" "Happy? Nora, I am overjoyed, terrified but overjoyed." He rested his hand gently on her still, flat stomach. "We are going to have a baby." The pregnancy progressed smoothly despite Nora's morning sickness, which lasted well into the 4th month. She continued teaching until June, when the school year ended and her condition was becoming too obvious to hide. The baby was due in late September, and Nora spent the summer preparing, sewing tiny clothes and blankets, setting up a cradle that Xavier had built with painstaking care. On a warm evening in late September 1883, Nora's labor began. Mrs. Hartley and the town's midwife, a capable woman named Sarah Chen, who had learned her trade from her mother in San Francisco, attended her through the long night. Xavier paced the main room of the cabin, starting at every sound, until Mrs. Hartley finally took pity on him and sent him to the livery with strict instructions to keep himself occupied. Just after dawn, Nora gave birth to a healthy baby boy. When they finally let Xavier into the bedroom, he found Nora propped up against pillows, exhausted but radiant, holding their son. The baby had a shock of dark hair and had already demonstrated a healthy set of lungs. "Meet your son," Nora said softly, and Xavier approached with the reverent care of someone holding something infinitely precious. "He is perfect," Xavier whispered, touching one tiny hand with his finger. The baby grasped it reflexively, and Xavier felt his eyes sting with tears. "What should we name him?" They had discussed names throughout the pregnancy but had never quite settled on one. Now, looking at their son, Nora said, "What about Thomas, after the man who gave you a new start?" Xavier looked up at her, his eyes bright. "Thomas Bridger Lawson." He would have liked that. "Then Thomas it is." The baby changed everything and nothing all at once. Their days became structured around feedings and diaper changes and the particular needs of an infant. Nora was grateful she had the summer to adjust before she would need to return to teaching. Xavier was a devoted father, taking over the night feedings when he could so Nora could rest, walking the floor with Thomas when the baby was fussy, speaking to him in a gentle voice about horses and the livery, and all the things they would do together when Thomas was older. When the new school year began, Mrs. Hartley volunteered to watch Thomas during school hours. "I have experience with babies," she said gruffly, "and I like having the little one around. Keeps the boarding house from getting too quiet." So Nora returned to her students, and a new rhythm established itself. She would feed Thomas before school, then walk him to the boarding house in a basket that Xavier had padded with soft blankets. During her lunch break, she would return to nurse him. Then, after school ended, she would collect him and bring him home, where Xavier would be waiting, having closed the livery for the day. They would spend the evening together as a family, marveling at each small development as Thomas grew and changed. The years passed with a sweetness that Nora had never imagined possible. Thomas grew into a curious, active toddler, then a bright child who loved to help his father at the livery and listen to his mother read stories. When Thomas was 3, Nora became pregnant again, delivering a healthy daughter they named Margaret Rose after both their mothers. 2 years after that came another son, Samuel, and 3 years later, a second daughter, Elizabeth. Their cabin had grown along with their family. Xavier had added more rooms, creating bedrooms for the children and expanding the kitchen. What had started as a simple one-room shelter was now a comfortable family home filled with laughter and love. The children grew up surrounded by books and horses, learning to read at their mother's knee and developing a love of animals from watching their father work. Fort Garland grew as well. The railroad brought more settlers, and the town expanded to accommodate them. New businesses opened, more families arrived, and what had once been a rough frontier outpost began to take on the character of an established community. Xavier's livery thrived, and he eventually had to hire 2 additional men to help with the work. Nora's school grew from a single room with a dozen students to a proper schoolhouse with 2 classrooms and nearly 40 children. Through it all, the love between Xavier and Nora only deepened. They had the usual disagreements and stresses that came with raising 4 children and running 2 businesses, but they had learned to talk through their problems, to listen to each other, to remember what mattered most. On difficult days, they would remember that first winter when Nora had ridden into town with nothing but grief and Xavier had offered her his hearth and his heart. They had built something beautiful from that desperate beginning, a life full of meaning and purpose and love. One evening, when Thomas was 12 and Elizabeth was just 3, the family sat together at the dinner table. Thomas was excitedly telling them about a horse that had come into the livery that day, a beautiful mare with unusual markings. Margaret was arguing with Samuel about whose turn it was to clear the dishes. Elizabeth was more focused on playing with her food than eating it. Nora looked around at the chaos and felt her heart swell with gratitude. After the children had been sent to bed, Xavier and Nora sat together on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. It was something they tried to do every evening when weather permitted, stealing a few moments of quiet together after the demands of the day. "Do you ever think about that first day?" Xavier asked, his arm around Nora's shoulders. "When you rode into town on that frozen wagon," Nora leaned into him, remembering. "I think about it often. I was so lost, so certain that my life was over. I had no idea that the worst day of my life was actually the beginning of the best years. I saw you crying, and I just knew I had to help. I did not know then that helping you would change my entire life." "We saved each other," Nora said softly. "You gave me a home and hope when I had neither. I gave you a reason to believe in family again." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the sounds of the night. From inside the house came a thump and muffled giggling, evidence that not all the children were actually sleeping yet. Xavier sighed, but he was smiling. "I should probably go settle them down," he said, but he did not move. "In a minute," Nora said. "I want to stay like this just a little longer." So they stayed, holding each other under the Colorado stars, 2 people who had found each other in the depths of winter and built a spring that lasted a lifetime. The years continued to unfold with their mixture of joy and challenge. Thomas grew into a thoughtful young man with his father's skill with horses and his mother's love of learning. He worked alongside Xavier at the livery while studying with Nora in the evenings, dreaming of one day attending university in Denver to study veterinary medicine. Margaret inherited her mother's teaching instinct and her father's steady patience, often helping Nora with the younger students after school. Samuel was the adventurous one, always exploring the mountains around Fort Garland, coming home with stories of what he had discovered. Elizabeth was still too young to show her particular talents, but she had a sunny disposition that brightened every room she entered. As the children grew more independent, Xavier and Nora found themselves with more time for each other again. They would take long walks on Sunday afternoons, just the 2 of them, reliving their courtship days. They would stay up late talking after the children were asleep, discussing their dreams for the future, their hopes for their children, their gratitude for the life they had built. One particularly significant conversation happened on their 15th wedding anniversary. Xavier had arranged for Mrs. Hartley to watch the children for the evening, and he had prepared a special dinner at home. After they had eaten, he led Nora outside to the porch, where they could see the lights of Fort Garland twinkling in the valley below. 15 years, Xavier said, holding Nora close. Sometimes it feels like yesterday, and sometimes it feels like you have always been part of my life. I cannot imagine my life without you, Nora replied. You are my home, Xavier. Wherever you are, that is where I belong. I have been thinking about the future, Xavier said. Thomas is nearly grown. In a few years, he will be ready to take over the livery if he wants it, or to pursue his studies if that is his path. Margaret talks about becoming a teacher like you. The children are finding their own ways. It happens faster than we expect, Nora agreed. I look at them and still see babies, but they are growing into such capable, kind young people. It is because of you, Xavier said firmly. You have given them stability and love and education. You have shown them what strength looks like, what perseverance means. You came to this town with nothing, and you have built a legacy that will continue long after we are gone. We built it together, Nora corrected. I could not have done any of this without you. They stood quietly for a moment, then Xavier said, I want to make sure you know how much I love you. Not just for what you have given me, for our children, for our home, but for who you are. You are the bravest, most remarkable woman I have ever known. You took the worst moment of your life and turned it into something beautiful. You inspire me every single day. Nora felt tears slide down her cheeks, but they were happy tears. I love you too, Xavier. You saw me at my lowest point when I had nothing to offer, and you offered me everything. You gave me hope when I thought I had none left. You showed me that endings can become beginnings, that grief can transform into joy. You are the best man I know, and I thank God every day that I rode into Fort Garland on that frozen wagon. They kissed under the stars, their love as strong as it had been on their wedding day, strengthened and deepened by the years of partnership, parenthood, and shared purpose. The following years brought new changes and challenges. Fort Garland continued to grow, evolving from a frontier town into an established community with real civic infrastructure. The railroad expanded, bringing more commerce and opportunity. Xavier's livery remained a cornerstone of the community, but he began to gradually hand over more responsibility to Thomas and his other employees, allowing himself more time with his family. Nora continued to teach, becoming known throughout the region as an exceptional educator. Parents would move to Fort Garland specifically so their children could attend her school. When Thomas turned 18, he announced his intention to attend the Colorado Agricultural College to study veterinary medicine. It was a bittersweet moment for Xavier and Nora, proud of their son's ambition, but sad to see him leave home. They saw him off on a clear September morning, Nora crying despite her determination not to, Xavier gripping his son's shoulder and telling him to make them proud, knowing he already had. Margaret was 16 by then and had begun formally assisting Nora at the school, essentially serving as a student teacher. She had her mother's gift for connecting with children, for making even the most difficult subjects accessible and interesting. Samuel, at 14, was torn between his love of the outdoors and his growing interest in engineering, spending his free time sketching designs for bridges and buildings. Elizabeth, at 11, had developed a love of music and could often be found practicing on the piano that Xavier had surprised the family with 2 Christmases ago. As their children grew toward adulthood, Xavier and Nora found themselves reflecting more on the journey that had brought them to this point. They would often talk about that first winter, about the frozen wagon and the tears and the offer of warmth that had changed both their lives. They marveled at how a single act of kindness had rippled outward, creating not just their family but touching the entire community. The children they had raised were contributing members of society, and the students Nora had taught over the years were spread throughout Colorado and beyond, carrying her influence with them. One winter evening, nearly 20 years after that first meeting, Xavier and Nora sat by the fire in their cabin. The house was quieter now with Thomas away at college, though the other 3 children were upstairs, supposedly studying but more likely talking and laughing together. Xavier was reading the newspaper while Nora worked on mending a torn shirt of Samuel's. "Listen to this," Xavier said, looking up from the paper. "They are planning to build a new school in Fort Garland, a proper 2-story building with 4 classrooms and an assembly hall. They are calling for proposals from the community about what it should include." Nora set down her mending, her eyes bright with interest. "That is wonderful. The current building is bursting at the seams. We desperately need more space. You should submit a proposal. You know better than anyone what the school needs." "You really think they would listen to me?" Xavier set down the newspaper and looked at her seriously. "Nora, you are the most respected educator in this entire valley. Parents specifically choose to settle in Fort Garland because of you. If anyone should have a say in what the new school looks like, it is you." Encouraged by Xavier's support, Nora spent the next weeks drafting a detailed proposal. She outlined the need for age-appropriate classrooms, a library, proper laboratory equipment for science education, musical instruments for arts education, and a dedicated space for teacher training. She argued passionately for hiring at least 2 additional teachers to reduce class sizes and allow for more individualized instruction. When the town council met to discuss the proposals, Nora presented her ideas with the confidence that came from 20 years of successful teaching. The councilmen listened attentively, asking questions and taking notes. 3 months later, they announced that the new school would incorporate nearly all of Nora's suggestions, and they formally asked her to serve as the head teacher when the building opened. The school was completed in the fall of 1889, a beautiful 2-story brick building that was the pride of Fort Garland. Nora oversaw the hiring of 2 new teachers, both young women she had mentored. Margaret, now 21 and having completed her own teacher training, was hired as one of them, creating a beautiful continuity as mother and daughter worked side by side. The dedication ceremony for the new school was a major community event. The mayor gave a speech thanking all the contributors and builders. Then he called Nora to the podium, and she stood before the assembled crowd of families, students, and community members. "When I came to Fort Garland 20 years ago, I had nothing," she began, her voice steady despite her nervousness at public speaking. "I was grieving, lost, and terrified. This town, this community gave me a home. You gave me purpose. You trusted me with your children, the most precious things in your lives, and allowed me to be part of their education and growth." She paused, looking out at the familiar faces. Xavier stood in the front row with Samuel and Elizabeth, his eyes shining with pride. Margaret stood with the other teachers, beaming at her mother. Even Thomas had made the trip home from college for this occasion. This building represents more than just a school. It represents our commitment to the next generation, our belief that education can transform lives. I know that to be true because education transformed mine. Learning gave me hope when I needed it most. It gave me a career that has brought me joy and fulfillment. My deepest wish is that every child who enters these doors will find the same opportunities I found, the same chance to build a life of meaning and purpose. The crowd applauded warmly, and Nora stepped down from the podium directly into Xavier's arms. He held her close, whispering, "I am so proud of you. We did this together," she whispered back. "Everything we have built, we built together." The new school thrived under Nora's leadership. With more space and more teachers, they were able to expand the curriculum to include more advanced subjects. Students who had previously finished their education at 14 or 15 were now able to continue through age 18, preparing for university or skilled trades. The school gained a reputation for excellence that drew families from across the region. But even as her professional life flourished, Nora never lost sight of what mattered most. Her family remained her greatest joy. She treasured the evenings around the dinner table, the Sunday afternoons spent together, the small daily rituals that bound them together. She loved watching Xavier with their children, seeing the patience and care he brought to fatherhood, the way he made each child feel heard and valued. Thomas graduated from college and returned to Fort Garland to establish a veterinary practice, the first in the valley. He worked closely with his father, caring for the horses at the livery and making calls to ranches throughout the region. Margaret continued teaching alongside her mother, developing her own reputation as a skilled and compassionate educator. Samuel followed his interest in engineering, eventually working on railroad construction projects, but always returning home between jobs. Elizabeth pursued her love of music, giving piano lessons to supplement the family income and bringing beauty into their home with her playing. As their children entered adulthood and began building lives of their own, Xavier and Nora found themselves grandparents. Thomas married a kind-hearted woman named Rebecca, and they had 3 children in quick succession. Margaret married a rancher named Daniel, and they had 2 daughters. Even Samuel, despite his travels, eventually settled down with a woman he met in Denver, bringing her back to Fort Garland and starting a family. The cabin that had once housed just Xavier now overflowed with children and grandchildren on Sundays, filled with laughter and noise and love. Xavier and Nora would sit together and watch the chaos with deep satisfaction, marveling at the family tree that had grown from such unlikely roots. On their 30th wedding anniversary, their children organized a celebration at the new school's assembly hall. Nearly the entire town attended, a testament to the impact Xavier and Nora had made on the community. There were speeches and toasts, stories and laughter. Former students, now adults with children of their own, spoke about how Nora had influenced their lives. Business partners talked about Xavier's integrity and fairness. Friends shared memories of kindness and generosity, but the most touching moment came when Thomas stood to speak. "My parents taught us many things," he said, looking at Xavier and Nora. "They taught us the value of hard work, the importance of education, the necessity of kindness. But more than anything, they taught us what love looks like. Not the easy love of good times, but the deep, abiding love that weathers storms and builds foundations. They showed us that love is a choice you make every day in small acts of service and large gestures of sacrifice." He paused, emotion thick in his voice. "My mother rode into Fort Garland on the worst day of her life, broken and alone. My father saw her pain and offered help without hesitation or expectation of return. That single act of compassion created all of this." He gestured around the room, at the family, at the community. "Every person in this room has been touched by the love that began on that frozen winter day. We are all beneficiaries of my father's kindness and my mother's strength." There was not a dry eye in the room as Thomas finished speaking. Xavier and Nora stood together, holding hands, overwhelmed by the outpouring of love from their community. Nora thought back to that terrified girl on the frozen wagon, never imagining that such darkness could lead to such light. Later that night, alone in their cabin with the celebration over and the guests departed, Xavier and Nora sat together by the fire as they had done countless times over the years. 30 years, Nora said softly. Where did the time go? Into building a life, Xavier replied. Into raising children and loving each other and making a difference in this community. Do you have any regrets? Xavier thought about the question seriously. Not a single one. You. Only that I did not have even more years with you, Nora said. I wish I could go back to that girl on the frozen wagon and tell her that everything would be all right. That the kindness of a stranger would transform into the love of a lifetime. That the hearth he offered would become a home that would shelter not just her but generations to come. She would not have believed you, Xavier said with a smile. She would have thought it too good to be true. It does seem too good to be true sometimes, Nora agreed. But here we are, Xavier echoed, pulling her close, and I would not want to be anywhere else. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire burn low, neither wanting to break the spell of the moment. Outside, Fort Garland slept under a blanket of stars. Inside the cabin, two people who had found each other against all odds held each other close, grateful for every day they had been given, for every challenge they had faced together, for every joy they had shared. The years continued their inevitable march forward. Xavier and Nora both eventually retired from their active work, though Xavier still visited the livery most days to check on things and visit with Thomas. Nora stayed involved with the school in an advisory capacity, mentoring new teachers and occasionally guest teaching when a particular subject called for her expertise. Margaret took over as head teacher, carrying on her mother's legacy with pride. They spent more time with their grandchildren, watching them grow and develop their own personalities and dreams. They took longer walks together, traveled occasionally to visit Samuel and his family in Denver, hosted Sunday dinners that required multiple tables to seat everyone. Their love, which had been forged in crisis and strengthened through decades of partnership, remained the foundation of everything they did. One spring evening, when they were both in their early 70s, Xavier and Nora took a walk to the creek behind town, following the same path they had walked on that day he had proposed all those years ago. The landscape had changed some, with more buildings and more people, but the creek still flowed clear over smooth stones, and the mountains still rose majestically against the sky. "You remember the first time we walked here?" Nora asked, though she knew he did. "I was so nervous," Xavier admitted. "I had rehearsed what I was going to say 100 times, but when the moment came, I just blurted it all out. It was perfect," Nora assured him. "Every word of it was perfect." They found a smooth boulder and sat together, Xavier's arm around Nora's shoulders. They had both aged, their hair gray now, their bodies moving more slowly, but the essential core of who they were to each other remained unchanged. "I have been thinking about that day you arrived in Fort Garland," Xavier said. "About seeing you on that wagon, crying in the cold. I remember thinking you were the saddest thing I had ever seen, but also the most beautiful. I wanted to help you so badly, but I had no idea that helping you would become the defining act of my life. You saved me," Nora said simply. "In every way a person can be saved. You gave me shelter and hope and love. You gave me a family and a home and a purpose. You gave me a life worth living." "You saved me right back," Xavier replied. "I was going through the motions before you came, working, existing, but not really living. You taught me how to open my heart again, how to build something meaningful. You gave my life purpose and joy." They sat quietly, watching the water flow past, each lost in memories of the decades they had shared. Finally, Xavier spoke again. "I want you to know that if I had my life to live over again, I would not change a single thing. Every moment with you has been a gift. Every challenge we faced together made us stronger. Every joy we shared was magnified because we experienced it together. You are the love of my life, Nora Lawson, and you always will be." Nora turned to look at him, this man who had been her partner, her love, her home for more than 40 years. "And you are mine, Xavier, always and forever." They walked slowly back to town as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. Their children and grandchildren were gathering at the cabin for their weekly Sunday dinner, and they could hear the sounds of laughter and conversation as they approached. Xavier opened the door, and they stepped into the warmth and light, surrounded immediately by the people they loved most. Elizabeth was at the piano, playing a cheerful tune. Margaret and Rebecca were setting the table while Thomas and Daniel debated the merits of different horse breeds. Samuel had just arrived from Denver with his wife and 3 children. The grandchildren ranged in age from toddlers to teenagers, all talking and laughing and creating the beautiful chaos that came with a large, loving family. As Nora looked around at the scene, she felt overwhelmed with gratitude. All of this, every person in this room, every laugh and conversation and moment of connection, had grown from that single day when she had ridden into Fort Garland with nothing but grief and fear. Xavier had seen her tears and offered his hearth, and from that simple act of kindness, an entire world had been born. Dinner was its usual joyful chaos, with conversations overlapping, children requiring attention, food being passed around the crowded table. Afterward, while the adults cleaned up and the children played, Xavier and Nora slipped out to the porch for a few moments of quiet. "This is what happiness looks like," Nora said, listening to the sounds of their family inside. "This is what I never dared to dream was possible on that frozen wagon." "We built something good," Xavier agreed. "Something that will last long after we are gone. Our children will teach their children about kindness and love and perseverance. The students you taught will pass on what they learned. The values we tried to live by will ripple forward through time." "It all started with you," Nora said, "with your compassion for a stranger." "It all started with your courage," Xavier countered. "You could have given up that day. You could have turned around and gone back or despaired and stopped trying, but you kept going. You built a life from nothing. That took incredible strength." "We did it together," Nora said firmly. "Everything we have accomplished, we accomplished together." They stood there on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the deepening twilight, holding hands the way they had done for more than 40 years. Inside the cabin, their family carried on without them for the moment, but soon someone would notice their absence and come looking for them. For now, though, they had these few peaceful moments to themselves. "I love you," Xavier said quietly. "Thank you for saying yes all those years ago. Thank you for choosing to build a life with me. Thank you for offering me hope when I had none," Nora replied. "Thank you for seeing something worth saving in a broken girl on a frozen wagon. Thank you for every day since then." They went back inside together, back to the warmth and light and love that filled their home. The evening continued with stories and laughter, with children being put to bed in various rooms throughout the house, with the comfortable rhythms of a family that knew and loved each other deeply. As the years advanced further, Xavier and Nora slowed down but never stopped cherishing each day they had together. They celebrated birthdays and anniversaries, births and graduations. They grieved together when old friends passed away, and they rejoiced when new grandchildren and eventually great-grandchildren were born. Through it all, they remained devoted to each other, their love a constant in a changing world. Fort Garland continued to evolve around them. The town they had known as a rough frontier settlement had become a prosperous community with churches and schools, businesses and civic institutions. The railroad that had once been a source of transient workers now brought families seeking to build permanent lives. The school that Nora had helped build was now a centerpiece of the community, educating hundreds of children and preparing them for futures that would have been unimaginable in the early days. On the 50th anniversary of Nora's arrival in Fort Garland, the town organized a celebration in her honor. She tried to decline, insisting that she did not need recognition for simply doing her job, but the community would not hear of it. The celebration took place at the school, now officially renamed the Preston Lawson Academy, in honor of both Nora and Xavier's contributions to education and the community. The entire extended family attended, along with what seemed like half the population of Fort Garland and the surrounding valley. Former students, now middle-aged with children and grandchildren of their own, spoke about how Nora had changed their lives. Teachers she had mentored talked about the lessons they had learned from her. Community members described the impact of her dedication and Xavier's integrity on the character of Fort Garland itself. When it was finally Nora's turn to speak, she stood before the crowd with Xavier beside her, his hand steady on her arm. At 74, she moved more slowly than she once had, but her mind was as sharp as ever and her voice was strong as she addressed the assembly. "I came to Fort Garland 50 years ago as a frightened girl with nothing to her name but grief," she began. "I had lost my father, lost my home, lost any sense of what my future might hold. I rode into this town on a frozen wagon, tears streaming down my face, certain that my life was over." She paused, looking at Xavier. "And then this man, this wonderful, compassionate man, saw my pain and offered help. He did not know me. He had no reason to trust me or to invest his time and resources in a stranger. But he did it anyway, because that is who he is." Xavier Lawson saw someone in need and responded with kindness. "That simple act changed the course of my entire life." Her voice grew stronger as she continued. "But this community did more than just help one lost girl. You gave me a purpose. You trusted me to teach your children. You supported my dreams and encouraged my growth. You welcomed me into your homes and your hearts. You became my family when I had none. Every success I have had, every student I have taught, every contribution I have made to this town, all of it stems from the kindness and generosity of this community." She looked out at the sea of faces, many of them beloved and familiar. "I want to thank you all for 50 years of love and support. I want to thank my husband, who has been my partner and my strength through everything. I want to thank my children and grandchildren for bringing such joy into my life. And I want to say that Fort Garland will always be my home, not because of the buildings or the location, but because of the people. You took in a stranger and made her one of your own. You showed me what community really means. For that, I will be grateful every day for the rest of my life." The applause was thunderous, and more than a few people were wiping tears from their eyes. Xavier helped Nora back to her seat, and they sat together through the rest of the ceremony, hands clasped, hearts full. That night, back in their cabin with the celebration over, and the family departed to their own homes, Xavier and Nora prepared for bed with the comfortable efficiency of 50 years of practice. They moved slowly now, but they still shared the same bed they had shared since their wedding night, still found comfort in the familiar presence of the other. As they settled under the quilts, Nora rested her head on Xavier's shoulder. 50 years, she murmured. "It has been a good life, has it not?" "The best life," Xavier agreed. "Better than I ever imagined possible. Do you ever think about what might have happened if you had not helped me that day? If you had just walked past, or if I had arrived in Fort Garland on a different day when you were not there?" "I try not to," Xavier admitted. "It is too terrible to contemplate. My life would have been so empty without you." "Mine too," Nora said softly. "I think I would have survived somehow." I was stubborn enough, but I would never have truly lived. You taught me how to live, Xavier, how to hope and dream and love. You gave me everything." "We gave each other everything," Xavier corrected gently. "That is what love is, I think. Two people giving everything they have, and somehow ending up with more than they started with." They drifted off to sleep in each other's arms, just as they had done for 50 years, secure in the knowledge that whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it together. The remaining years of their lives passed with the gentle inevitability of all things. They celebrated their 55th wedding anniversary surrounded by children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. They watched as Fort Garland entered the 20th century, bringing new technologies and new changes. They mourned the loss of old friends and welcomed new members into their ever-expanding family. Through it all, their love remained constant. They still took daily walks when weather permitted, still sat together by the fire in the evenings, still found joy in the simple act of being together. Age had slowed their bodies, but had not diminished the connection between their hearts. Xavier passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 82, Nora beside him as she had been for 57 years. The grief was overwhelming, a physical pain that made it hard for Nora to breathe. But she found comfort in their children and grandchildren, in the memories of decades of love, in the knowledge that they had built something beautiful together. The funeral was the largest Fort Garland had ever seen. The entire town shut down to honor the man who had contributed so much to the community. Thomas delivered the eulogy, speaking about his father's integrity, kindness, and unwavering love for his family. He talked about the legacy Xavier had left, not just in the successful livery business or the family he had raised, but in the countless small acts of kindness he had performed throughout his life. "My father taught me that strength is not about force but about compassion," Thomas said. "He showed me that true success is measured not in wealth, but in the lives you touch." He demonstrated every single day what it means to love deeply and live honorably. We are all better people for having known him. Nora lived for 3 more years after Xavier's death, surrounded by family and continuing to serve as an advisor to the school that bore her name. She never remarried, telling anyone who asked that she had already experienced the love of a lifetime and needed no other. She spent her time with her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, sharing stories of Xavier and the early days of Fort Garland, ensuring that the history of their love would be passed down through the generations. On a warm spring evening in 1913, Nora passed away peacefully in her sleep, in the same bed where she had spent decades with Xavier. Her children found her with a smile on her face, her hand resting on Xavier's pillow, as if even in death she was reaching for him. They buried her beside Xavier in the Fort Garland cemetery, on a hillside overlooking the town they had both loved. The headstone reads simply, "Nora Preston Lawson, 1859–1913. Beloved wife, mother, teacher, friend. She rode into town with tears and left it with love." At the funeral, Margaret read a letter her mother had written to be opened after her death. Through tears, she shared Nora's final words with the assembled crowd. "To my dearest family and friends," the letter began. "If you are reading this, then I've gone to join my beloved Xavier, and I confess that my heart is at peace with that. We had 57 beautiful years together, but it was not enough. 1,000 years would not have been enough. I want you to know that my life was filled with more joy than I ever deserved or expected. I came to Fort Garland as a broken girl, but this town and the people in it, especially my Xavier, helped me become whole. You gave me purpose and love, and a family that extended far beyond blood ties. To my children, know that you were my greatest accomplishment and my deepest joy. Watching you grow into the remarkable people you have become has been the privilege of my life. To my grandchildren and great-grandchildren, remember that love is the most important thing. Choose it every day in big ways and small. Let it guide your decisions and shape your character. To the town of Fort Garland, thank you for giving me a home. Thank you for trusting me with your children and allowing me to contribute to this community. Take care of each other. Show kindness to strangers, because you never know whose life you might change with a simple act of compassion. And to anyone who might hear my story in years to come, know this. Even in your darkest moments, hope is possible. Even when you have lost everything, new beginnings can emerge. Love can find you when you least expect it and transform your entire world. I am living proof of that truth. I rode into Fort Garland on a frozen wagon, tears streaming down my face, certain that my life was over. Instead, I found a cowboy who offered me his hearth and, in doing so, gave me everything. That moment of kindness rippled forward through 57 years of marriage, 4 children, 12 grandchildren, and 18 great-grandchildren. It influenced every student I taught, every life I touched, every small good thing I was able to do in this world. Never underestimate the power of compassion. Never stop believing in second chances. And never, ever stop choosing love. The letter ended with Nora's signature, and Margaret folded it carefully, tears streaming down her face. Around the cemetery, there was not a single dry eye. The story of Xavier and Nora had become part of Fort Garland's identity, a reminder of the power of kindness and the enduring nature of true love. In the years that followed, their children and grandchildren worked to preserve their legacy. The Preston Lawson Academy continued to provide excellent education to generations of students. The livery, though eventually replaced by automobile services, was preserved as a historical landmark honoring Xavier's contribution to the town. A scholarship fund was established in both their names, helping students pursue higher education. But perhaps the greatest legacy was the example they had set. Their story was told and retold, teaching new generations about compassion, perseverance, and love. Young couples would visit their graves on their wedding days, seeking inspiration from a love that had lasted through decades. Teachers would invoke Nora's dedication to their students. Business owners would strive to emulate Xavier's integrity. The cabin where they had raised their family was eventually donated to the town and converted into a museum, carefully preserved to show how life had been lived in Fort Garland during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Visitors could see the hearth where Xavier had first offered Nora warmth, the table where they had shared countless meals, the bedroom where they had slept side by side for 57 years. On the mantel of that hearth, in a place of honor, sat a small brass plaque that their children had commissioned. It read, "In this place, on a frozen December day in 1881, a cowboy saw a woman's tears and offered his hearth." From that single act of kindness grew a love that changed a town and touched countless lives. May all who enter here be inspired to show compassion to strangers and to believe in the transformative power of love. And so the story lived on, passed down through generations, a testament to the truth that Nora had written in her final letter, that even in the darkest moments, hope is possible, that endings can become beginnings, that a single act of kindness can change everything. That love, once kindled, can warm not just 2 hearts but an entire community, not just for a season but for generations to come. The frozen wagon that brought Nora Preston to Fort Garland had carried more than just a grieving girl and her deceased father. It had carried the seeds of a love story that would inspire a town, a family legacy that would extend across more than a century. and a reminder that the most profound transformations often begin with the simplest acts of human compassion. Xavier Lawson had offered his hearth to a crying stranger, and in return, he had received a lifetime of love and a legacy that would never be forgotten.